In 1972, the electromotive division of General Motors built a locomotive that would outlive nearly every one of its rivals. It wasn't the fastest machine on the rails, and it certainly wasn't the most powerful, but it was the one you could always count on. The SD40-2 arrived without fanfare, without bold claims of revolution. It was simply there, ready to work, and it never stopped. 50 years later, the SD40-2 is still out there. It's hauling freight across plains and mountains, switching cars in rural yards, and proving a truth that modern engineering sometimes forgets. Simplicity lasts longer than innovation. While newer locomotives have come and gone, plagued by computer failures and complex systems that break down in the field, the SD40-2 keeps running. It's become more than just a locomotive. It's a testament to an era when machines were built not to impress, but to endure. This is the story of how one design became the backbone of North American railroading and why, decades after production ended, it refuses to fade away. This is the story of the locomotive that defined a generation. To understand why the SD40-2 became a legend, you have to understand what came before it. The 1960s were a time of chaos for American railroads. The transition from steam to diesel had been completed, but the industry was far from stable. Mergers were reshaping the railroad map. Bankruptcies were common, and in the middle of all this upheaval, diesel locomotive technology was evolving at a breakneck pace that left many railroads struggling to keep up. The 1950s had seen the first generation of diesel locomotives mature. The F units, the GP7s and GP9s, the SD7s and SD9s, these were the machines that had finally killed the steam locomotive. They were reliable enough, economical enough, and powerful enough to prove that diesel was the future. But by the early 1960s, railroads wanted more. They wanted more horsepower to pull longer trains. They wanted better reliability to reduce maintenance costs. And they wanted locomotives that could handle the increasingly diverse demands of modern freight service. EMD responded with a new generation of locomotives powered by their 645 series engine, replacing the older 567 that had powered the first generation. The SD40 arrived in 1966, offering 3,000 horsepower in a 6-axle package. It was a significant step forward. The 645 engine was more powerful and more efficient than what had come before. But the SD40 had its issues. Maintenance could be complicated. The electrical systems, while functional, were prone to problems that required significant diagnostic time. Crews liked the power, but shop forces found themselves spending more time troubleshooting than they wanted to. Meanwhile, competition was heating up. General Electric was pushing their U-boat series, offering competitive horsepower and undercutting EMD on price. Alco was still in the game with their Century series, though their days were numbered. Railroads were buying locomotives from multiple manufacturers, trying to find the best balance of power, reliability, and cost. But what they really wanted, what they desperately needed, was something that would just work, day after day, year after year, without drama. The railroad industry of the late 1960s was an industry under strain. Passenger service was collapsing. Freight traffic was facing new competition from trucks and planes. Major carriers were merging out of necessity, creating giants like Burlington Northern and, later, Conrail. These massive systems needed locomotives that could handle anything, run anywhere, and be maintained by crews with varying levels of expertise at facilities scattered across thousands of miles of track. EMD saw the problem clearly. The SD40 was good, but it could be better. It needed to be simpler, more standardized, easier to diagnose and repair. It needed to be a locomotive that would outlast the financial troubles of its owners, that would survive technological fads, that would become so reliable that railroads would trust it with their most important trains. What EMD needed to build was a workhorse. And that's exactly what they set out to do. In 1972, EMD rolled out a locomotive that wasn't revolutionary. It was just perfected. The SD40-2 was built on lessons learned, not gambles taken. While competitors were experimenting with new technologies and pushing boundaries, EMD took a more conservative approach. They looked at what worked, what didn't, and what could be improved. The result was a locomotive that embodied a philosophy: evolution over revolution. The foundation was the same 16-cylinder 645E3 engine that powered the original SD40, 3,000 horsepower, turbocharged, reliable. But EMD didn't just drop the same engine into a new frame and call it a day. They refined everything around it. The frame itself was stretched to 68 feet, 10 inches, longer than the SD40. This extra length served multiple purposes. It allowed for better weight distribution, smoother riding characteristics, and most importantly, it accommodated EMD's new FlexiCoil truck design. The trucks, the wheeled assemblies that actually contact the rail, were critical to locomotive performance. The FlexiCoil design used a different suspension system that improved adhesion and provided a more stable ride. For crews, this meant less jarring motion and better handling, especially in curves. For the railroad, it meant better traction and less wear on both the locomotive and the track. Those extended walkways at each end of the locomotive, the distinctive porches that gave the SD40-2 its characteristic look, were a direct result of the longer frame. They became one of its most recognizable features. But the most important innovation was under the hood, in the electrical system. The -2 designation referred to EMD's second-generation modular electrical control system. Previous locomotives, including the SD40, used complex wiring harnesses that could be nightmares to diagnose when problems arose. The -2 system broke everything down into standardized modular components. If an electrical issue occurred, you could isolate which module was causing the problem and replace just that component. You didn't need a master electrician with years of experience. You needed someone who could follow a logical diagnostic path and swap out a module. This might sound like a small thing, but it transformed maintenance. Out on the line, hundreds of miles from a major shop, a crew could diagnose and repair electrical faults that would have sidelined older locomotives for days. At major facilities, repairs that once took skilled electricians, hours could now be completed in a fraction of the time. The -2 system meant more time on the road and less time in the shop. For railroads counting every dollar, this was invaluable. The cab layout was simplified compared to some of EMD's earlier designs. Controls were straightforward, gauges were easy to read. There was nothing fancy about it, but that was the point. A crew could step into an SD40-2 cab and immediately understand what they were looking at. Training new engineers was easier. Maintenance crews could check systems without confusion. Everything about the design prioritized function over form. EMD's approach to part standardization was equally important. Components were designed to be universal across EMD's entire locomotive line where possible. Traction motors, air compressors, electrical modules, many of these parts were interchangeable with other EMD models. For railroads with diverse fleets, this meant smaller parts inventories and simpler logistics. You didn't need separate stock for every locomotive type. You could maintain a fleet of different EMD models with largely the same parts. The initial buyers understood what they were getting. Burlington Northern, one of the largest railroads in North America, placed massive orders. Union Pacific, Chessie System, Soo Line, and eventually Conrail followed. These railroads weren't buying the SD40-2 because it was exciting or cutting edge. They were buying it because they needed locomotives that would work without complaint, that could be maintained anywhere, and that would still be earning their keep decades down the line. EMD delivered exactly what was promised. The SD40-2 wasn't built to win awards or push technological boundaries. It was built for the long haul, and that deliberate, almost conservative design philosophy would prove to be its greatest strength. What made the SD40-2 special wasn't just the power it produced, it was what you could do with it. Every inch of this locomotive was designed to be repaired, reused, and run forever. The engineering philosophy was simple: build it tough, make it accessible, and ensure that when something breaks, anyone with basic training can fix it. At the heart of the SD40-2 was the EMD 16645E3 prime mover. This was a two-stroke diesel engine, a design that EMD had refined over decades. The 645 designation came from the displacement of each cylinder, 645 cubic inches. With 16 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, this engine produced 3,000 horsepower at 900 revolutions per minute. It wasn't the most powerful engine in the world, but it was bulletproof. The genius of the 645 engine was in its modularity. Each cylinder was a self-contained unit. If one cylinder developed problems, you could remove just that power assembly, the liner, piston, connecting rod, and replace it without tearing down the entire engine. This modular approach extended to nearly every major component. The turbocharger, the fuel injectors, the exhaust system, all were designed for rapid removal and replacement. A well-equipped shop could swap out a turbocharger in hours, not days. The turbocharger itself was critical to the engine's performance. By forcing more air into the cylinders, it allowed the engine to burn fuel more efficiently and produce more power without increasing the physical size of the engine. The 645E3 used a roots blower for low-speed operation and a turbocharger for higher speeds, ensuring good performance across the entire operating range. This combination meant the SD40-2 could start a heavy train from a standstill and maintain that power as speed increased. Power from the engine drove a main alternator, which produced electricity. This was then converted and distributed to 6 DC traction motors, one on each axle. The transition from mechanical power to electrical power was what made diesel locomotives practical. You didn't need complex transmissions or clutches. The engineer controlled the flow of electricity to the motors, which turned the wheels. Simple, efficient, and infinitely adjustable. The traction motors themselves were rugged, air-cooled units designed for continuous heavy duty. They were mounted on the trucks, directly coupled to the axles through gear reduction. Each motor was capable of tremendous torque, and because the electrical system could precisely control the power to each motor, wheel slip was manageable even under the most demanding conditions. The SD40-2 could dig in and pull trains that would overwhelm less capable locomotives. The flexicoil truck design was another key to the SD40-2's success. Previous truck designs used different suspension systems that could be harsh, especially at higher speeds or on rough track. The flexicoil system used coil springs arranged in a way that provided both vertical compliance and stability in curves. The result was a smoother ride for crews and better adhesion for traction. The trucks themselves were heavy, durable castings designed to handle the stress of starting and stopping trains weighing thousands of tons. The cooling system was equally well thought out. Large radiator sections mounted at the rear of the locomotive handled the heat generated by the engine. Electric fans, controlled by thermostats, pulled air through the radiators. The system was designed with enough capacity to handle sustained full-throttle operation in hot weather, pulling heavy trains up steep grades. Overheating was rarely an issue. The dynamic brake system deserved special attention. When slowing a train, especially on downhill grades, wheel brakes alone can overheat and fail. The dynamic brake system turned the traction motors into generators, using the momentum of the train to produce electricity. That electricity was then dissipated as heat through large resistor grids, cooled by powerful fans mounted on the roof of the locomotive. The SD40-2's dynamic brakes were robust and effective, allowing engineers to control heavy trains on mountain grades without relying solely on air brakes. The -2 electrical system tied everything together. Instead of miles of individual wires running throughout the locomotive, the -2 system used modular control cards mounted in accessible cabinets. Each card controlled a specific function: load regulation, wheel slip control, transition between series and parallel motor configurations. If a problem occurred, indicator lights would point to the faulty module. A technician could pull the card, replace it with a spare, and have the locomotive back in service in minutes. The failed card could be sent to a central repair facility where specialists could troubleshoot and fix it properly. This approach revolutionized locomotive maintenance. Previously, electrical problems could take days to diagnose. Technicians would trace wires, check connections, and gradually narrow down the source of the fault. With the -2 system, diagnostics were systematic and fast. Even relatively inexperienced maintainers could handle most common issues. This meant locomotives spent more time earning revenue and less time sitting in shops. Field maintenance was where the SD40-2 truly shined. Out on the line, far from major facilities, these locomotives could be kept running with basic tools and spare parts. The design assumed that breakdowns would happen, and it made dealing with them as straightforward as possible. Access panels were well placed. Major components could be removed without requiring specialized lifting equipment. Everything about the mechanical design assumed that repairs would be needed and made them as painless as possible. The result of all this engineering was a locomotive that simply worked. It started in sub-zero temperatures. It ran in desert heat. It pulled coal trains, grain trains, intermodal consists, and general manifest freight. It didn't complain, didn't require coddling, and didn't surprise you with mysterious failures. Crews trusted it because it had earned that trust through sheer reliability. Maintenance forces appreciated it because it didn't waste their time with complicated problems. Management loved it because it made money. The SD40-2 wasn't a masterpiece of innovation. It was a masterpiece of balance, power, reliability, maintainability, and economy, all in perfect harmony. That's what made it legendary. By the mid-1970s, you couldn't look anywhere in North America without seeing an SD40-2. They became the background noise of a continent, from the Canadian prairies to the Mexican border, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific coast. These locomotives were everywhere. They weren't just common, they were dominant. Over 3,900 SD40-2s were built between 1972 and 1989, making it the most produced six-axle locomotive model in North American history. This wasn't a fluke. Railroads kept ordering them year after year because they had proven themselves. In an industry where a single locomotive breakdown could delay a train, cost thousands in lost productivity, and tie up crews and equipment, the SD40-2's reliability was worth its weight in gold. Burlington Northern was one of the largest operators, eventually owning over 900 units. These locomotives became synonymous with the railroad itself. The distinctive cascade green and black paint scheme, worn by hundreds of SD40-2s, became an iconic sight across the northern tier of the United States. BN used them on everything. Coal drags coming out of Wyoming's Powder River Basin, grain trains rolling across Montana and North Dakota, manifest freights through the Pacific Northwest. The SD40-2 was BN's workhorse, and the railroad trusted them with its most important trains. Union Pacific took a similar approach, eventually operating hundreds of SD40-2s in their armor, yellow, and harbor mist gray livery. UP ran these locomotives across their vast system, from the deserts of the Southwest to the mountains of Wyoming and Utah. They pulled intermodal trains racing across the plains, coal trains laboring up Sherman Hill, and general merchandise freights serving countless industries. The SD40-2 proved itself equally capable in every service. Canadian Pacific and Canadian National embraced the SD40-2 just as enthusiastically. CP's distinctive maroon and gray scheme became familiar across Canada and into the northern United States. CN's black and white units worked the frozen reaches of northern Canada and the busy corridors of the south. These locomotives handled brutal winter conditions without complaint, starting reliably in temperatures that would defeat lesser machines. Conrail inherited a diverse fleet when it was formed from the ruins of several bankrupt northeastern railroads in 1976. They standardized on the SD40-2, eventually operating several hundred units in their bright blue livery. These locomotives became the backbone of Conrail's efforts to rebuild northeastern freight service, handling everything from coal trains to intermodal runs. Smaller railroads operated them too. Regional carriers, short lines, and switching railroads all found uses for the SD40-2. Its versatility was remarkable. The same locomotive that could lead a mile-long coal train across Wyoming could also switch cars in a tight urban yard or pull a local freight making dozens of stops to serve small-town industries. The SD40-2 earned its reputation through performance. It started trains in any weather. In the depths of winter, when temperatures dropped well below zero, SD40-2s would fire up and go to work while other locomotives struggled. In summer heat, climbing mountain grades with heavy trains, they'd keep pulling without overheating or losing power. They were utterly dependable. Crews loved them. Engineers appreciated the straightforward controls and predictable behavior. The throttle response was smooth and linear. The dynamic brakes were powerful and reliable. The cab, while not luxurious, was functional and sensibly arranged. You knew exactly what an SD40-2 would do in any situation because they all behaved the same way. There were no surprises, no quirks to learn, no mysterious behaviors that varied from unit to unit. This consistency extended across the entire fleet. An engineer who had trained on SD40-2s for one railroad could step into a unit from a different railroad and immediately feel at home. The controls were the same. The performance was the same, the sound, the feel, the response, all identical. This standardization made crew training simpler and allowed railroads to use their SD40-2s interchangeably across different divisions and different services. Maintenance crews shared the same appreciation. The locomotives were so well designed for servicing that even smaller facilities could handle major repairs. The modular electrical system meant that troubleshooting didn't require specialists. The mechanical components were robust and didn't wear out prematurely. Parts were readily available. When repairs were needed, they were straightforward. This ease of maintenance kept availability rates high. SD40-2s spent more time pulling trains and less time sitting in shops waiting for repairs. The economic impact was significant. For railroads operating on thin margins, every percentage point of availability mattered. Every hour of unplanned downtime cost money. The SD40-2's reliability directly improved the bottom line. Trains ran on time, crews didn't sit idle waiting for power, shippers got their freight when expected. The ripple effects of that reliability spread through the entire operation. Photographers and railroad enthusiasts took notice. The 1980s saw an explosion of railfan activity, and the SD40-2 was everywhere in the photographs. Its distinctive long hood and porches made it instantly recognizable. The variety of paint schemes, BN green, UP yellow, CP maroon, Conrail blue, CN black, Chessie orange, and dozens more, meant that every photo was different even when the locomotive model was the same. The SD40-2 became the face of modern railroading. The competition couldn't match it. General Electric's -7 series locomotives, introduced in the late 1970s, offered comparable power but suffered from reliability issues early in their production. Maintenance crews who had grown accustomed to EMD's straightforward designs found GE's electrical systems more complex and troublesome. While GE eventually improved their designs, the SD40-2 had already established itself as the standard by which all other locomotives were judged. Through the 1980s, the SD40-2 remained the first choice for most major freight railroads. Even as EMD introduced newer models with more horsepower and advanced features, many railroads continued ordering the proven SD40-2. Why risk a new design when the old one works so well? Production continued until 1989, by which point the SD40-2 had become more than just a locomotive model. It had become an institution. These were the golden years, when the SD40-2 defined what a freight locomotive should be: reliable, versatile, economical, tough. It pulled America's freight through good times and bad, through economic booms and recessions, through winter storms and summer heat. It just worked. And that, more than anything else, is why it ruled the rails. In an era of 4,400 horsepower microprocessor-controlled locomotives, the SD40-2 keeps showing up. Rebuilt, repainted, rewired, but still fundamentally itself. The fact that these locomotives remain in service decades after production ended speaks volumes about the original design. Many railroads have found that keeping SD40-2s running is more economical than replacing them with newer power. The rebuild programs began in earnest in the 1990s and continue today. These aren't just simple overhauls. Major railroads and locomotive leasing companies have invested millions in comprehensive rebuilding programs that essentially create new locomotives from old frames. Canadian Pacific's SD40-2R program took hundreds of aging SD40-2s and gave them new electronics, upgraded cabs, modern safety systems, and fresh paint. The result was a locomotive with most of the reliability of the original, but with modern control systems that improved performance and reduced emissions. Other rebuild programs took different approaches. Some focused on fuel economy, installing more efficient fuel injection systems and better engine controls. Others concentrated on extending service life, replacing worn components with new or remanufactured parts. Progress Rail, one of the largest locomotive rebuilding companies, has offered several SD40-2 rebuild packages over the years. Their SD22 ECO program takes SD40-2 cores and installs modern Tier 2 compliant engines, reducing emissions while maintaining reliability. These rebuilt locomotives command premium prices because railroads know what they're getting: proven mechanical design with modern controls. Even without formal rebuild programs, many SD42s have been kept running through systematic maintenance and component replacement. It's not uncommon to find units from the 1970s still in service, having accumulated millions of miles. They've had engines overhauled, traction motors replaced, electrical systems updated, and countless other repairs, but the basic machine remains the same. This longevity isn't accidental. It's the direct result of EMD's original design philosophy: build it to last and make it repairable. The secondary market for SD42s remains strong. As major Class 1 railroads have retired units, they've been snapped up by regional railroads, short lines, and leasing companies. For smaller operations, a well-maintained SD40-2 represents an affordable, reliable source of power. These railroads don't need the latest technology. They need locomotives that will start every morning, pull their trains, and not require a staff of specialists to maintain. The SD40-2 fits that requirement perfectly. Yard switching and local freight service have become primary roles for aging SD40-2s. These duties don't require the sustained high speeds of mainline service, but they demand reliability and flexibility. A locomotive that spends its day making dozens of switching moves, starting and stopping repeatedly, needs to be mechanically sound and responsive. SD40-2s excel in this service. Their rugged construction handles the stress, and their simple controls make them ideal for switching operations, where crews are constantly getting on and off. Short-line railroads, the smaller carriers that serve local industries and connect to the major railroads, have embraced the SD40-2 enthusiastically. Many short lines operate just a handful of locomotives, and mechanical reliability is critical. A breakdown can mean the entire railroad is out of service. For these operations, buying a used SD40-2 from a major railroad makes perfect economic sense. The price is reasonable, parts are available, and any diesel mechanic with experience can work on them. Across rural America, SD40-2s continue moving grain, lumber, aggregate, and countless other commodities that never see a major railroad. The international market has provided another avenue for SD40-2 survival. Dozens of units have been exported to South America, where they continue pulling freight on railroads in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Some have gone to Africa. A few have ended up in Asia. These locomotives built for North American railroads have proven adaptable to different operating conditions and different maintenance practices. The fundamental soundness of the design transcends borders. Leasing companies, which own locomotives and rent them to railroads as needed, maintain significant fleets of SD40-2s. When a railroad needs extra power for seasonal traffic or to cover for units in the shop, they can lease an SD40-2 and know exactly what they're getting. The universal familiarity with the type means crews don't need special training. The standardization means maintenance forces can handle any issues. This fungibility has kept SD40-2s valuable in the leasing market long after newer models have depreciated. Modern railroads still find uses for them. BNSF Railway, formed from the merger of Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, retains SD40-2s for local service and switching. Canadian Pacific and Canadian National continue operating rebuilt units. Kansas City Southern uses them on secondary routes. Union Pacific has kept some in service for maintenance trains and local freights. These aren't museum pieces or nostalgia. They're active members of the fleet earning their keep. The economics are compelling. A modern Tier 4 compliant locomotive costs several $1,000,000 and comes with complex emissions control systems that require specialized maintenance. A rebuilt SD40-2 costs a fraction of that amount and can be maintained by standard shop forces. For services where maximum horsepower isn't required, the choice is obvious. Why spend money on capability you don't need when the SD40-2 can do the job reliably and economically? The railfan community has embraced the SD40-2 as an icon. Hundreds of preserved units sit in museums and rail parks across North America. Some are operational, used for special events and excursions. Others are static displays, carefully maintained as examples of late 20th century railroad technology. Railway museums recognize that the SD40-2 represents a pivotal period in railroad history, and they've worked to ensure that examples are preserved for future generations. Model railroad manufacturers have produced SD40-2 models in every scale, with every major paint scheme. For many modelers, no freight train is complete without at least one SD40-2 in the consist. The locomotive has become shorthand for North American railroading in the 1970s through 1990s. Its image appears in railroad art, photography books, and documentaries. It's the locomotive that people think of when they picture a freight train. This cultural presence matters because it reflects the real impact the SD40-2 had. For an entire generation of railroaders, it was the locomotive they learned on, worked with, and trusted. For communities along rail lines, it was the machine they saw every day pulling the trains that connected them to the broader economy. For the industry, it represented a standard of excellence that influenced every diesel locomotive design that followed. The SD40-2's survival isn't about nostalgia, though there's certainly some of that. It's about fundamental value. These locomotives continue working because they're still useful, still reliable, still economical. In an industry that's brutally pragmatic about equipment, the SD40-2 has earned its place through sheer merit. That's the ultimate validation of EMD's design philosophy. Build it right, and it will last. Technology moved on, but the SD40-2 never really left. Horsepower increased. Computer controls replaced analog systems. AC traction superseded DC motors. Environmental regulations drove new designs. The railroad industry evolved, but through all those changes, the SD40-2 remained. Not because it had to, but because it still worked. There's a certain purity to the SD40-2. It represents an approach to engineering that prioritizes function above all else. No unnecessary complexity. No features added for marketing purposes. Just a well-thought-out design, executed with quality components and careful attention to the realities of railroad operation. In an age where products are often designed for obsolescence, the SD40-2 stands as proof that building something to last is possible. The lessons from the SD40-2's success extend beyond railroads. The value of simplicity, the importance of maintainability, the wisdom of proven technology over unproven innovation. The recognition that reliability and availability matter more than peak performance specifications. These principles apply to any field where machines must work day after day without fail. The SD40-2 didn't just teach the railroad industry these lessons. It demonstrated them so convincingly that they became impossible to ignore. For the people who worked with these locomotives, the SD40-2 became more than just equipment. Engineers who spent thousands of hours at the controls of SD40-2s developed a familiarity that bordered on intimacy. They knew the sound of the engine at different throttle settings, the feel of the dynamic brakes, the precise response to control inputs. Maintenance crews knew these locomotives inside and out, could diagnose problems by sound or smell, could tear down and rebuild major components in their sleep. That accumulated knowledge, passed from one generation of workers to the next, became part of the culture of railroading. The communities along rail lines developed their own relationships with the SD40-2. The sound of those 645 engines became the soundtrack of daily life. The sight of a string of SD40-2s pulling a coal train or intermodal consist was as familiar as the landscape itself. For small towns that depended on rail service, these locomotives represented connection to the wider world, the means by which local products reached distant markets and needed supplies arrived. The SD40-2 wasn't just a machine, it was part of the infrastructure that made modern life possible. Photographers captured them in every conceivable setting: mountain passes and prairie straightaways, urban yards and rural branch lines, snow and sun, dawn and dusk. Through all those images runs a common thread: the SD40-2 at work, doing what it was built to do. Those photographs document not just a locomotive, but an era, a way of railroading, a time when the dominant technology had reached a point of mature refinement. The irony is that the SD40-2 succeeded by not trying to be revolutionary. EMD didn't set out to build the greatest locomotive ever made. They set out to build a locomotive that would reliably do the work railroads needed done, that could be maintained by the people railroads employed, that would earn back its purchase price and continue generating revenue for decades. They succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, not through genius, innovation, but through careful, methodical engineering and an unwillingness to compromise on quality. That success changed the industry. The SD40-2 set a standard that every subsequent locomotive has been measured against. When railroads evaluate new power, one of the questions they ask is, will this be as reliable as the SD40-2? When engineers critique modern locomotives, they often compare them unfavorably to the straightforward simplicity of the SD40-2. The type cast a long shadow, and that shadow remains. Today, when you hear a 645 engine growling under load, when you see those distinctive porches and the long hood stretching ahead, there's a recognition. That's an SD40-2. It's still here, still working, still proving that good design doesn't age. The younger locomotives around it may have more horsepower, more sophisticated controls, better fuel economy, but the SD40-2 doesn't care. It just keeps doing what it's always done. Every whistle echoing through the plains, every growl under a heavy freight, every rhythmic clatter of wheels on rail somewhere, an SD40-2 is still doing what it was built to do, pulling trains, moving freight, connecting the continent. It's the sound of reliability, the face of a time when machines were built to last, the living proof that sometimes the simplest answer is the best answer. The SD40-2 became a legend not through flash or spectacle, but through steady, unrelenting competence. It showed up every day and did the work. It didn't break down, it didn't complain, it just ran. For 50 years, through changing times and changing technologies, it ran. And in that simple fact lies its immortality. Built in 1972, still running strong, the locomotive that defined a generation.